In this video, we're digging back into the new CSS framework features introduced in Bricks 2.2. Previously, we took a look at dealing with the colors and setting all of that up. I'll link that video down below. In this video, we're moving on and taking a look at the spacing options. So what I've got in front of me is basically a very simple layout, and we've got no real styling going on. So we're going to deal with the spacing side of things first, and I'll show you how we can implement that as we go through the process. Now, to access these options, we simply come to the styles option in the top left-hand corner. And inside here, we've now opened up the Style Manager. So on the left-hand side, we've got a series of icons that allow us to switch between the various different parts of our CSS framework. For example, we've got our classes, variables, colors, typography, and spacing. Come back up to the top, we've got our theme styles. I've already created a blank theme style. I've given it a name, and nothing other than setting a condition has been done inside here. So we are basically working with what you'd have on a blank site. Take a look at the top right-hand side. You can see we've got some more icons. If we use this first option, this full screen, it'll maximize the Style Manager, which I think is a great way of working. And you'll also notice we get this little eye icon that allows us to toggle the canvas preview. If we click on this, this will show us the page. If you don't want to use that, you can click the eye icon. So I'm going to leave that off for now. You'll also notice we've got desktop, tablet, portrait, and so on, the various different breakpoints. This relates to when we're working inside the preview. So if we want to change, we can use those to see what it'll look like. So let's disable this preview and carry on. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the spacing section. Inside here, the first thing we can do is create our first scale. Now, we're going to call this spacing. That's perfectly fine. We click on create, and that will create a first set of spacing options. Now, if you've ever used any other kind of framework like Core Framework and so on, or any of the sort of online generators for dealing with spacing and so on, this is going to be very familiar. But I'm going to go over it anyway, and I'm going to show you how you can set this up, how we start to use it, and we'll also take a look at the utility classes down below. So first things first, we've got a name for this, that's perfectly fine. However, if you want to rename this scale, you absolutely can do by clicking on the rename option. You can create new scales, you can reset the scale, and you can take a look at the generated CSS. Let's move over to the left-hand side now and take a look at the options top to bottom. First of all, we can enable the manual values. Now you can see at the moment, all these values are automatically generated based upon what we're choosing for the minimum, maximum, and so on. If we want to override those values, we can enable this, and now we can manually set any of the minimum or maximum for any of these different spacing definitions. In our example though, we're going to leave it as it is and let the automatic setup work for us. Next, we've got the variable prefix. You can see space is set inside here, and if we take a look, we've got space 2xs, xs, and so on. If you wanted to change that, for example, you may want to have this set as s, for example, you can absolutely do that. Let's put it back to space. Then underneath, we've got the scale type. You can see it says t-shirt. Now, this might sound a little odd to start off with, but basically what it means is that we use a sizing that we'd see in t-shirts: small, medium, large, extra large, and so on. And that's exactly what you can see here. We go from 2XS to 2XL and all the options in between. However, you can change this to numeric if you want to. You'll see it'll automatically update for us, or you can come in and you can set it to custom. So you can set what you want inside here. In this example though, we're going to set this to be t-shirt because I think that works the best. It's pretty simple and self-explanatory. Then you've got your baseline step. This basically says what is going to be the default value. Now, generally when you're working with sizing inside sort of web design, 16 pixels is the base value. So that's what we're saying here, is we're saying that the medium has that 16 pixel value. If we want to change that, you can absolutely change it inside here. But in most cases, I would say basing this on the M or medium is probably the most logical way of working. This is what you'll generally tend to see in other CSS frameworks. Then you've got your minimum and your maximum. Your minimum is for mobile, your maximum for desktop. What this is basically saying is that on a mobile, this is the smallest it's going to get if you use this particular definition. So in other words, space M, the smallest this spacing is going to get is 16 pixels. If you're on a desktop, the maximum it's going to become is 20 pixels, and it scales accordingly. And those scales are governed by this type scale ratio. So you can see this is set to 1.25. So this basically means every step above or below will increase or decrease by this factor. If we take a look at your space medium, it'll start at 16, then you go to large, it'll increase by 1.25, jumping up to 20. Then from large to extra large, it'll go up another 1.25 up to 25, and so on. The same thing then works in reverse. So from space M to space S, it'll decrease by 1.25. Hope that's making sense. If it doesn't, don't worry too much about it, because this is giving you a visual representation of what it's going to look like, and you can easily come back into the Style Manager and edit and update these should you need to. So if you find you want to increase your spacing globally across all of the different layout elements, you can simply come in here and make the changes. That's the beauty of a CSS framework. Nothing is written in stone. It's totally flexible. So then we go to the maximum desktop, and you can see this basically works in the same way. So the 20 and the scale. If we change one of these scales, so for example, we'll say this going from 1.33 up to maybe like a 1.875, you can see the difference between the minimum and the maximum becomes considerably larger. If you want to reduce that, you can change this scale, and you can see we can adjust that. So let's set these back to what they were. 1.25, and in this case, 1.33. Okay, so there's our basics. So what we need to do now is simply generate these variables. If we don't generate these variables, nothing will get added in. So we'll make this sort of setup inside here, but nothing will actually be generated. So once we click this, we get a confirmation to say, okay, say yes, we do. That's now generated those 7 variables. We can take a look at this in a couple of ways. If we come over to the option here for generated CSS and click, there's all of our variables that have been created. And you can see it's taken the naming convention we said, and it's using clamp. So even though it displays it as a pixel value, it is using clamp when it comes to the actual CSS definition for the variable. This means we get beautiful fluid spacing. We don't have sort of jumps between different sizes. It will scale proportionally and nice and smoothly. So let's just save this to make sure we commit those changes. And now if we come up to our variables, inside here, you can see there's our spacing variables. And because we've used the native function inside Bricks 2.2, you'll see it's also categorized them inside spacing. And it tells us it's using a scale. So pretty cool that we can do that. But what if you want to add more in here? You want to go beyond this 2XL or 2XS? Well, that's no problem at all. Let's come back into our spacing. And you can see when we hover over any of these, we can click the plus or we can delete it. So let's come down, click the plus, and say, there you go, 3XL. You can see it automatically picks up any of the scale ratios. All that's being done for us. So we can easily add what we want inside here. Let's go to 4XL, for example. And now what we're going to do is click on Generate Variables. It'll tell us that this will overwrite any existing variables. We don't end up with duplicates. We'll say OK. Check that out. You can see there's our additional variables all set inside there. And if you come back to our variables, you can see there's our variables. And now we have 9 instead of 7. It's very simple, very easy. And if you want to remove them, basically works the same way. So let's come back into our spacing. Say we don't want this 4XL. Click the little trash. It's gone. Again, come over Generate Variables. Click OK. Job done. So now before we move on to the utility classes, let's take a quick look at how we start to use these variables and how they work inside the editor in Bricks. So coming back into our page, I've got what I want to be a 3-column layout here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my container and we're going to set this to be a grid. So come over to display and change this over to grid. You see nothing happens because we haven't actually told it how we want to lay this out. So let's just do a really super simple 3-column grid. And now you'll see there's no gaps in between any of these rows or columns. So we need to address that as well. So coming to our gap, we could obviously type in something like 2rem, and that will do the job perfectly. But that's not really what we want to do. We're not using those variables. So let's remove that. Click on our variable option. And inside here, you can see there's our spacing. Expand this. There's all of our definitions. And as we hover over, you can see it shows us what this is going to look like. So let's pop in space M. We now have space applied here. Let's say now we want to come into our card and we want to put some space in between each of the different elements. Well, we can do the same thing. Selecting our card, making sure we've got that class selected. We're going to come down to where we've got the row gap. Again, we're going to click on our variables, and inside here, we can hover over and see what these are going to look like. I think 2XS looks pretty good. Click on that. We now have spacing that's fluid inside here. So now we've done that, if we made any changes here to any of our scales and so on, that will update accordingly. Okay, so now we've set our spacing up and we've seen how to integrate that into our workflow. Let's go back and take a look at those utility classes and how we can set those up. So like before, we're going to come up to our styles and open this up. Let's maximize our window. We're already in spacing. Let's come down to our utility classes and let's add a utility class. Now what we're going to do is we're going to give this a class name. So we're going to call this padding, use a dash, and we're going to use the little star. This is basically like a wildcard. And what that wildcard is going to do is it can replace the values inside there with the different steps we've got here. So 2XS to 3XL. So that will create a utility class for us. However, what are we actually going to apply this to? In this example, we want to apply it to padding. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the CSS property. In this case, padding. Obviously, you could have padding left, padding right, padding top, padding bottom, and you could work in that way. We're just going to use this as a kind of global catch-all padding utility class. So what we're going to do now is going to click on Generate Utility Classes. That creates 8 utility classes, which is exactly the same as we've got here for our variables, 8. Let's save this. Let's take a look at our generated CSS. And now on top of our variables, we now have these utility classes set underneath. And as you can see, what they're doing is we've got padding 2xs is using the variable of space 2xs, and so on and so forth. So now we've got a utility class that we can use and apply padding all around whatever element we choose. Let's take a look. Let's make sure we save this. So for this example, let's just choose something that's easy to see. We'll choose one of the images. I'm going to come over, we're going to apply that new class to it, that new utility class. So inside here, you can see we've got spacing. If we open this up, you can see there's our padding. And as you can see, as we go through it, it shows what that padding is going to look like all around it. So this is basically creating a utility class that references the variables that we've set up for our spacing. Hope that makes sense. It can be a little bit confusing once you start to kind of use it, but once you get your head around it, it's actually quite simple and straightforward. For me personally, I don't really use utility classes like this very often, but they are handy if you want to access those. If you need them, you can create them using the CSS framework options in Bricks 2.2. If you don't need them, you can just basically leave them empty. It's entirely up to you. The option's there should you want to use it. So what we've seen in this video is we've seen how to create our spacing variables. We've seen how to apply those variables. We've seen how to edit them. We've also seen how to create utility classes and how to tie those into our variables. So we now have everything we need to be able to work with spacing, fluid spacing inside Bricks itself. Now, hopefully you found this useful, and if you want to follow the other videos in this series, check out the link in the description down below. As always, my name is Paul C. This is WPTuts, and until next time, take care.